The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the royal palace as Captain Marcus Wellington adjusted his red ceremonial uniform one final time. 23 years of service had taught him that every detail mattered when protecting the royal family. The gold buttons on his jacket gleamed, his black boots reflected the sky above, and his tall ceremonial hat sat perfectly straight on his graying head. Marcus had seen many changes during his time as a royal guard. Kings had come and gone, protocols had evolved, and the world outside the palace walls had transformed dramatically. But one thing remained constant: his unwavering dedication to duty and honor. Today felt different though, as if something significant was about to unfold. The Royal Guard was an elite force, selected from the finest military personnel in the kingdom. Each member underwent years of rigorous training, not just in combat and security, but in protocol, diplomacy, and the ancient traditions that governed their service. Marcus had risen through the ranks slowly, earning respect through his integrity and courage. His fellow guards looked up to him, and even the royal family members knew him by name. On this particular Tuesday morning, the palace was preparing for an important state visit. The Prime Minister of a neighboring country was arriving with his security detail, and tensions had been running high due to recent diplomatic disagreements. The palace security team had been working around the clock to ensure everything would proceed smoothly. Marcus stood at his post near the main entrance, watching as various officials scurried about making final preparations. His trained eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, looking for anything out of place. After more than 2 decades of service, this vigilance had become second nature to him. The first sign of trouble came at exactly 10:37 in the morning. A convoy of black vehicles approached the palace gates, moving faster than protocol dictated. Marcus immediately noticed that something was wrong. The lead vehicle bore diplomatic plates, but the occupants were wearing tactical gear instead of the formal attire expected for a state visit. As the vehicles came to a stop, armed men in full combat gear emerged from each car. They wore black uniforms with SWAT written across their backs in bold white letters. This was highly irregular, as foreign security forces were not permitted to operate within the palace grounds in full tactical equipment. Protocol clearly stated that visiting security personnel should be in formal dress and carry minimal armament. The leader of the group, a tall man with a stern expression and military bearing, approached the palace entrance with purpose. His name tag read Commander Jackson, and his demeanor suggested he was accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than diplomacy. His squad followed closely behind, their hands resting on their weapons in a manner that suggested they were ready for immediate action. Marcus stepped forward to intercept the group, his movements calm but authoritative. "Gentlemen, I'm Captain Wellington of the Royal Guard. I need to see your authorization papers for this type of security presence on palace grounds." Commander Jackson barely glanced at Marcus before responding with obvious irritation. "We don't need authorization from palace guards. We're here on official business with full diplomatic immunity. Step aside." The tension in the air became palpable. Other royal guards had noticed the commotion and were slowly moving into position, their training kicking in automatically. Marcus maintained his composure, but his voice carried the weight of absolute authority when he spoke again. "Sir, regardless of your diplomatic status, all security protocols must be followed within these grounds. I'm going to need to see proper documentation and coordinate with palace security before your team can proceed." What happened next would be talked about for years to come. Commander Jackson's face flushed with anger at being challenged by what he clearly viewed as a mere ceremonial guard. Without warning, his hand shot out and struck Marcus across the face with a sharp slap that echoed off the palace walls. The sound seemed to freeze time itself. Royal guards throughout history had faced many dangers and insults, but never had anyone dared to strike one of them on palace grounds. The act was not just an assault on Marcus personally, but an attack on the crown itself, the institution he represented, and centuries of tradition and honor. Marcus felt the sting of the blow, but his expression remained unchanged. Years of military discipline had taught him to control his emotions even in the most challenging situations. However, the fire in his eyes revealed that something fundamental had just shifted. This was no longer a simple diplomatic disagreement or security misunderstanding. The other royal guards who had witnessed the incident moved closer, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. The palace grounds, which moments before had been filled with the routine bustle of preparation, now hummed with dangerous tension. Staff members who had been going about their duties stopped and stared, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Commander Jackson seemed to realize immediately that he had made a serious error in judgment. The confidence that had carried him from his vehicles to the palace entrance began to waver as he looked around and saw the faces of the royal guards. These were not ordinary security personnel or ceremonial figures. They were elite soldiers with real training and genuine authority. Marcus slowly reached up and touched his cheek where the blow had landed, never taking his eyes off Commander Jackson. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable edge of steel. "Commander Jackson, you have just committed an act of aggression against a representative of the Crown on sovereign territory. This incident will have consequences that extend far beyond this moment." The weight of those words began to settle on everyone present. What had started as a diplomatic visit was rapidly transforming into an international incident. The SWAT team members behind Jackson began to look uncomfortable, realizing that their leader's actions had potentially put them all in an extremely difficult position. Palace security cameras had captured everything, and, within minutes, alerts were being sent to the highest levels of government. The Minister of Foreign Affairs was contacted, the palace security chief was summoned, and emergency protocols were being activated. The carefully planned state visit was about to become a diplomatic nightmare. Marcus straightened his uniform jacket and adjusted his ceremonial hat, his movements deliberate and dignified. Despite the assault he had just endured, he maintained the bearing and composure expected of his position. This was what separated the Royal Guard from ordinary security forces, their ability to represent the crown with honor even under the most trying circumstances. The other guards formed a subtle but unmistakable defensive formation around Marcus, their loyalty and solidarity evident without words. They had trained together, served together, and now they stood together in the face of this unprecedented insult. The brotherhood of the Royal Guard was stronger than any individual, and an attack on one was truly an attack on all. Commander Jackson looked around nervously, perhaps beginning to understand that his moment of anger had created a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. The diplomatic immunity he had mentioned so confidently might not protect him from the consequences of striking a royal guard on palace grounds. International law was complex, but some violations carried serious repercussions regardless of diplomatic status. Meanwhile, inside the palace, word of the incident was spreading rapidly through the halls of power. The Queen's private secretary was briefing Her Majesty on the situation, while the Prime Minister was being contacted about the potential diplomatic crisis that was unfolding on the palace steps. Emergency meetings were being called, and legal advisors were being consulted about the proper response to such an unprecedented event. The morning that had started with routine preparations for a standard diplomatic visit was transforming into something that would test the very foundations of international relations and royal protocol. Marcus stood at the center of it all, representing not just himself but the dignity and authority of the crown itself. As the tension continued to build, it became clear that what happened next would depend not just on the actions of those present, but on decisions being made in the highest corridors of power. The slap that had echoed off the palace walls was about to echo through the halls of diplomacy, and the retribution that Marcus had quietly promised was beginning to take shape in ways that Commander Jackson could never have imagined. The Royal Guard had been insulted, the crown had been disrespected, and the carefully maintained protocols that governed international relations had been shattered with a single, thoughtless act of violence. The consequences of that moment would unfold over the coming hours and days, but one thing was certain: Commander Jackson's impulsive action had set in motion events that would change everything. The palace grounds remained eerily quiet as everyone waited to see what would happen next, but beneath that surface calm, powerful forces were beginning to move. The retribution that was coming would be swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating for those who thought they could insult the crown and walk away unscathed. Within minutes of the incident, the palace transformed into a hub of urgent activity. Word traveled through secure communication channels faster than Commander Jackson could have imagined possible. In the Queen's private office, Her Majesty was receiving a detailed briefing from Sir Richard Blackwood, the palace security chief, whose normally calm demeanor showed visible signs of controlled fury. Your Majesty, Sir Richard reported, his voice tight with restrained anger, Captain Wellington was physically assaulted by the visiting SWAT commander on palace grounds. The entire incident was captured on multiple security cameras from various angles. The Queen, despite her advanced age, had lost none of her sharp intellect or commanding presence. She listened to the report with the kind of icy calm that had intimidated world leaders for decades. When Sir Richard finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming silently on the polished surface of her desk. "Sir Richard," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "Captain Wellington has served this crown with distinction for over 20 years. No one, regardless of their position or nationality, strikes a representative of this monarchy without facing the full consequences of their actions." Meanwhile, in the Foreign Office across London, phones were ringing frantically as news of the incident reached the highest levels of government. Foreign Secretary Margaret Thornton was in an emergency meeting with her senior staff, trying to understand how a routine diplomatic visit had deteriorated so rapidly into an international crisis. "Get me the ambassador immediately," she ordered her aide. "And, I want a complete background check on this Commander Jackson within the hour. How did someone with such poor judgment end up leading a security detail for a state visit?" Back at the palace, Marcus remained at his post, though additional guards had discreetly joined him. His face still bore the red mark of the slap, but his bearing remained as dignified as ever. He could see Commander Jackson conferring urgently with his team members, their body language suggesting they were beginning to understand the gravity of their situation. The SWAT team members were looking increasingly uncomfortable as they noticed more royal guards taking positions around the palace entrance. These were not the ceremonial figures they had expected to encounter. Each guard was a highly trained military professional with years of combat experience, and their displeasure at seeing their captain assaulted was becoming increasingly evident. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, Marcus's second-in-command, approached him with a formal bearing that barely concealed her anger. "Captain, we have new orders from the palace security chief. All visiting security personnel are to remain exactly where they are until this matter is resolved through proper diplomatic channels." Marcus nodded, understanding the implications. What Lieutenant Morrison was really telling him was that Commander Jackson and his team were now effectively detained on palace grounds. They could not leave, they could not proceed with their mission, and they could not contact their superiors without palace approval. The diplomatic immunity that Jackson had claimed so confidently was about to be tested in ways he never anticipated. In the palace communications center, encrypted messages were flying between London and the visiting delegation's home country. The incident was being reported at the highest levels, with prime ministers and foreign ministers being briefed on a situation that threatened to derail carefully planned diplomatic relations. The visiting country's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Elena Vasquez, was rushing to the palace in her official car, her phone pressed to her ear as she received increasingly urgent instructions from her capital. She had spent years building positive relationships with British officials, and now one of her country's security officers had potentially destroyed months of careful diplomatic work with a single moment of poor judgment. How could this happen? She demanded of her aides sitting beside her. Commander Jackson was specifically briefed on palace protocols. He knew that any physical contact with Royal Guard personnel was absolutely forbidden under any circumstances. Her aide, consulting his tablet frantically, looked up with a worried expression. "Ma'am, it gets worse. Our preliminary intelligence suggests that Captain Wellington is not just any Royal Guard. He's a decorated veteran who served in 3 combat zones before joining palace security. He's also the son of Lord Wellington's nephew, making him connected to some very powerful families in British society." Ambassador Vasquez felt her heart sink. A simple protocol violation was one thing, but assaulting a war hero with noble connections on palace grounds was a diplomatic catastrophe of the highest order. She began mentally preparing for the most difficult conversation of her career. Meanwhile, in Downing Street, Prime Minister Charles Harrison was receiving his own briefing on the situation. His advisors were unanimous in their recommendation: this incident required an immediate and decisive response that would send a clear message about the consequences of disrespecting British sovereignty. "The Queen has personally requested that we treat this matter with the utmost seriousness," his chief of staff reported. "Her Majesty views this not just as an assault on Captain Wellington, but as an attack on the monarchy itself."
Prime Minister Harrison understood the implications immediately.
When the Queen personally involved herself in a diplomatic incident, it meant that normal diplomatic niceties were off the table. The government would be expected to respond with all the authority and power at its disposal. "Contact the Home Secretary and the Attorney General," he ordered.
"I want to know every legal option we have for dealing with this situation.
And get me a direct line to their Prime Minister.
This conversation is going to happen at the highest level."
Back at the palace, Commander Jackson was beginning to realize that his situation was deteriorating rapidly. His attempts to contact his superiors had been politely but firmly blocked by palace security. His team members were growing increasingly nervous as more royal guards appeared around the palace grounds, their presence subtle but unmistakable. Marcus observed Jackson's growing discomfort with professional detachment. He had seen this pattern before in combat zones, the moment when an aggressive individual realizes they have severely misjudged their situation and the consequences are about to be far worse than they anticipated. "Sir," Lieutenant Morrison reported quietly to Marcus, "we've received word that the visiting delegation's ambassador is en route to the palace.
She's requested an emergency meeting with palace officials to discuss the incident."
Marcus nodded, knowing that Ambassador Vasquez was about to have one of the most difficult days of her diplomatic career. The woman had a reputation for professionalism and competence, but even the most skilled diplomat would struggle to explain away an unprovoked assault on a royal guard. In the palace's formal reception rooms, preparations were being made for what would be anything but a routine diplomatic meeting. The Queen's private secretary was coordinating with Foreign Office officials to ensure that every aspect of the response would be carefully calibrated to demonstrate both the seriousness of the offense and the consequences of disrespecting the crown.
The legal implications were becoming clearer by the hour.
While diplomatic immunity provided certain protections, it did not extend to acts of violence against representatives of the host country's government. Commander Jackson's assault on Marcus had potentially voided any immunity protections his delegation might have claimed. Sir Richard Blackwood was coordinating with Scotland Yard's Diplomatic Protection Unit to ensure that all legal requirements were being met. This was uncharted territory. No foreign security officer had ever dared to strike a royal guard on palace grounds in living memory. "The precedent we set here will be remembered for decades," he explained to his senior staff.
"If we allow this incident to be resolved quietly, it sends a message that foreign delegations can treat our people with impunity. That's absolutely unacceptable."
The media had not yet gotten wind of the story, but palace officials knew it was only a matter of time. Emergency public relations strategies were being developed to ensure that when the story broke, it would be told from the proper perspective. The British public would not take kindly to learning that a foreign officer had assaulted one of their royal guards.
Ambassador Vasquez arrived at the palace gates to find a very different atmosphere than she had expected.
Instead of the routine security checks she was accustomed to, she was met by senior palace officials whose expressions left no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. "Ambassador," Sir Richard greeted her with formal courtesy, "I'm afraid we have a most serious matter to discuss. Your security chief has committed an act of violence against one of Her Majesty's royal guards. This incident has been reported to the highest levels of government, and there will be consequences." As she was escorted into the palace, Ambassador Vasquez could see Commander Jackson and his team still standing near the entrance, now clearly under guard. The arrogant confidence Jackson had displayed earlier had evaporated completely, replaced by the dawning realization that his career and, possibly his freedom, were now in serious jeopardy. The formal meeting that was about to take place would determine not just the fate of Commander Jackson, but the future of diplomatic relations between two nations. The slap that had echoed off the palace walls was about to reverberate through the highest corridors of international power, and the retribution that was coming would be swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating. Marcus remained at his post, a living symbol of the dignity and authority that had been attacked. His calm professionalism in the face of assault had already begun to transform him from a victim into a symbol of everything the Royal Guard represented. The consequences of that transformation were about to unfold in ways that would shock everyone involved. The formal meeting between Ambassador Vasquez and senior palace officials took place in the Blue Drawing Room, a space typically reserved for the most important diplomatic discussions. The room's elegant decor and historical significance served as a stark reminder of the centuries of tradition that had been violated by Commander Jackson's reckless action. Present at the meeting were Sir Richard Blackwood, Foreign Secretary Margaret Thornton, the Queen's Private Secretary Lord Pemberton, and Ambassador Vasquez. The atmosphere was tense, with each participant understanding that the decisions made in the next hour would have far-reaching consequences for international relations. Ambassador Vasquez, Lord Pemberton began with formal courtesy that barely concealed his anger. "We find ourselves in an unprecedented situation. A member of your security detail has committed an act of violence against a representative of the Crown on sovereign territory. This is not merely a diplomatic incident, it is an assault on the monarchy itself." Ambassador Vasquez had prepared extensively for this meeting during her journey to the palace, but facing the combined authority of British officialdom was more intimidating than she had anticipated. "Lord Pemberton, Sir Richard, Secretary Thornton, I want to express my government's sincere regret for this incident. Commander Jackson's actions were completely unauthorized and contrary to every protocol we established for this visit." Foreign Secretary Thornton leaned forward, her expression stern. "Ambassador, regret is insufficient. Your security chief struck one of our most respected royal guards without provocation. Captain Wellington has served this country with distinction for over 2 decades, including combat deployments in some of the world's most dangerous regions. The idea that he should be subjected to violence while protecting the crown is absolutely intolerable." Meanwhile, outside the palace, the media had finally gotten wind of the story. News vans were beginning to arrive, and reporters were already reaching out to their contacts within the government for more information. Palace press officials were coordinating with Downing Street to ensure a unified response when the story inevitably broke. Back at his post, Marcus continued his duties with the same professionalism he had demonstrated throughout his career, but the red mark on his face had become a powerful symbol. Other royal guards were taking turns checking on him, their solidarity evident to everyone present. The brotherhood of the guard had been challenged, and they were responding as they had been trained, as one unified force. Lieutenant Morrison approached Marcus with another update. "Captain, we've received word that Commander Jackson's government has been contacted directly by the Prime Minister's office. They're demanding an immediate explanation for their officer's conduct." The political implications were becoming clearer by the hour. The visiting country's government was facing a diplomatic crisis that threatened to damage their international reputation. Their carefully planned state visit had become a public relations nightmare, and they needed to find a way to resolve the situation without appearing weak or losing face entirely. In the blue drawing room, the discussion was becoming increasingly heated. Sir Richard was outlining the legal ramifications of the incident, making it clear that diplomatic immunity would not protect Commander Jackson from prosecution. Under British law, assault on a royal guard is a serious criminal offence, he explained to Ambassador Vasquez. The Crown Prosecution Service is already reviewing the case, and they have clear video evidence of the attack. Your commander is looking at potential criminal charges that could result in significant jail time. Ambassador Vasquez felt the walls closing in around her. What would it take to resolve this matter diplomatically? My government is prepared to offer formal apologies and appropriate compensation. Lord Pemberton exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding. Ambassador, this goes beyond simple compensation. The dignity of the crown has been attacked. Captain Wellington represents not just himself, but centuries of tradition and service. The resolution must reflect the severity of that offense. At that moment, an aide entered the room and whispered something urgently to Sir Richard. His expression darkened as he listened, and, when the aide left, he turned to address the group. I've just received word that the media has the story. Within the hour, this incident will be front-page news across the country. The British public is about to learn that a foreign security officer struck one of their royal guards on palace grounds. The political pressure for a strong response is about to become immense. Ambassador Vasquez knew this was the moment when diplomatic crisis management became a race against time. Once the story hit the media, public opinion would make it much more difficult for either government to find a quiet resolution to the incident. The first news reports were already being broadcast as they spoke. Television anchors were describing the shocking assault on a royal guard and unprecedented attack on palace security. Social media was beginning to explode with outrage from British citizens who viewed the royal guard as symbols of national pride and tradition. Prime Minister Harrison was receiving minute-by-minute updates on the situation while preparing for what he knew would be a very difficult phone conversation with his counterpart in the visiting country. The diplomatic stakes were rising rapidly, and both governments needed to find a solution that satisfied public expectations while preserving important bilateral relationships. "Get me their prime minister on a secure line immediately," Harrison ordered his communications staff.
"This conversation needs to happen before this story spins completely out of control."
Back at the palace, Commander Jackson was beginning to understand the full scope of the crisis he had created. His team members were looking at him with barely concealed anger, realizing that his moment of poor judgment had potentially destroyed their careers and damaged their country's international standing. Marcus observed Jackson's deteriorating emotional state with professional detachment. He had seen strong men break under pressure before, and it was clear that the SWAT commander was approaching his breaking point. The arrogance and aggression that had characterized his earlier behavior had been replaced by visible fear and confusion. The palace's legal department was working around the clock to ensure that every aspect of the response was properly documented and legally sound. This was not just about seeking justice for Marcus, it was about establishing precedents that would protect future royal guards from similar attacks. Phone calls were being made to senior military commanders, former royal guards who now held positions of influence, and members of parliament who had served in the armed forces. A network of support was being mobilized that extended far beyond the palace walls. The visiting country's ambassador to the United Nations was being briefed on the situation, as were their ambassadors in major capitals around the world. The incident was rapidly becoming an international embarrassment that threatened to overshadow years of diplomatic progress. In the Blue Drawing Room, Ambassador Vasquez was presented with a preliminary list of demands for resolving the crisis. The conditions were more severe than she had hoped, but, given the circumstances, they could have been much worse. Ambassador, Foreign Secretary Thornton explained, "We require the immediate removal of Commander Jackson from his position and his return to your country to face appropriate disciplinary action. We also need a formal apology from your head of government, delivered personally to Her Majesty. Finally, we want assurances that your security protocols will be completely reviewed to prevent any similar incidents." The demands were substantial but not unreasonable given the severity of the offense. Ambassador Vasquez knew that her government would have to swallow their pride and accept terms that would publicly acknowledge their officers' wrongdoing. The conversation was interrupted by another urgent message. The Queen herself had requested to be briefed on the proposed resolution. This was highly unusual. Normally, the monarch would remain above such diplomatic disputes. Her personal involvement signaled that the palace viewed this incident as a matter of the highest importance. Within the hour, another development would dramatically escalate the situation. A thorough background check on Commander Jackson had revealed information that would transform the incident from a diplomatic embarrassment into a full-blown international scandal. The retribution that was coming would be more devastating than anyone had imagined. As afternoon approached, the palace grounds remained under heightened security. Marcus continued his duties, but he had become something more than just a royal guard. He had become a symbol of national dignity that had been attacked and would be defended with the full power of the British state. The wheels of justice and diplomacy were turning, and Commander Jackson was about to discover that striking a royal guard on palace grounds was the worst decision he had ever made in his life. The consequences were only beginning to unfold, and they would be swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating for everyone involved in the attack. The bombshell that changed everything came at 3:47 in the afternoon. Intelligence services had completed their thorough background investigation of Commander Jackson, and what they discovered sent shockwaves through both governments. The man who had struck Captain Marcus Wellington was not just a security officer with poor judgment, he was under active investigation in his home country for corruption, arms trafficking, and connections to organized crime. Sir Richard Blackwood received the classified report while still in meetings at the palace, and his expression grew darker with each page he read. Commander Jackson had been using his position to facilitate illegal weapons shipments, and several of his associates were already under arrest in ongoing criminal investigations. "This changes everything," Sir Richard announced grimly to the assembled officials.
"We're not just dealing with a diplomatic incident anymore.
We have a suspected international criminal who committed assault on palace grounds while supposedly providing security for a state visit." The revelation transformed the entire nature of the crisis. What had begun as an embarrassing diplomatic incident was now a major security breach that threatened to expose systemic failures in the visiting country's vetting procedures.
How had a man under criminal investigation been chosen to lead security for such an important diplomatic mission? Ambassador Vasquez was immediately recalled to the Blue Drawing Room, where she was presented with the devastating intelligence report.
As she read through the documented evidence of Jackson's criminal activities, her face grew pale with the realization of how completely her country had been compromised. "Ambassador," Lord Pemberton stated with cold formality, "your government sent a suspected criminal to provide security at our sovereign palace. This is not merely diplomatic negligence, it represents a fundamental failure of your security apparatus that puts our entire relationship in question." The political ramifications were immediate and severe. News of Jackson's criminal background was shared with select media outlets within the hour, and the story exploded across international headlines. "Criminal strikes Royal Guard" and "Palace security breach" dominated news cycles around the world. Prime Minister Harrison's phone conversation with his counterpart became one of the most difficult diplomatic exchanges in recent memory. The visiting country's leader was forced to acknowledge not just the assault on Captain Wellington, but the embarrassing security failure that had allowed a criminal to represent their government at the highest level.
"This is beyond unacceptable," Harrison stated bluntly during the call.
"You've compromised the security of our palace, assaulted one of our most respected guards, and damaged our bilateral relationship in ways that will take years to repair. The consequences will be proportional to the severity of these failures." Meanwhile, Marcus continued his duties with the same professional dignity he had maintained throughout the crisis, but he was no longer just a victim of assault, he had become the symbol of institutional integrity standing against criminal corruption. The red mark on his face had faded, but its symbolic importance had only grown stronger. The full weight of British institutional power was now being brought to bear on the situation. Scotland Yard's International Crimes Unit was coordinating with intelligence services to gather additional evidence of Jackson's criminal activities. The Crown Prosecution Service was preparing charges that would ensure he faced the full consequences of his actions.
Legal experts were unanimous in their assessment: Jackson's diplomatic immunity was completely void due to his criminal activities and the assault he had committed. He would face prosecution under British law, and his own government was powerless to protect him without triggering an even more severe diplomatic crisis. The visiting country's government was forced to make increasingly humiliating concessions to prevent the complete collapse of their international relationships. Jackson was immediately stripped of all authority and placed under arrest by his own security team. His government issued public apologies that acknowledged both the assault and their failure to properly vet their security personnel. But the retribution was far from complete. Financial intelligence units had begun investigating Jackson's assets and bank accounts, uncovering a complex network of corruption that implicated several other officials in his government. The scandal was spreading rapidly through their security and diplomatic apparatus. Within hours, 3 other members of Jackson's security detail were also placed under investigation for their connections to his criminal activities. What had been presented as an elite security team was actually a criminal organization that had infiltrated the highest levels of government service. The international implications were staggering.
Intelligence agencies from multiple countries were reviewing their own relationships with the visiting nation's security services, discovering a pattern of corruption that had gone undetected for years. Jackson's assault on Marcus had inadvertently exposed a major international crime syndicate.
Ambassador Vasquez found herself in an impossible position.
Her government was facing not just diplomatic consequences, but potential economic sanctions and the suspension of important military and intelligence cooperation agreements. The assault on a royal guard had triggered a comprehensive review of all bilateral relationships.
The British response was swift and decisive. Economic agreements worth billions of pounds were suspended pending a complete investigation of corruption within the visiting country's government.
Military cooperation programs were terminated, and intelligence sharing was halted indefinitely. Marcus, meanwhile, had received personal messages of support from veterans organizations, military units, and members of the royal family. His dignified response to the assault had earned him recognition as a symbol of everything the Royal Guard represented: honor, duty, and unwavering service to the crown. The Queen herself issued a rare public statement praising Marcus's conduct and condemning the attack on the institution he represented. "The Royal Guard serves this monarchy and this nation with distinction and honor," her statement read. "Any attack on these brave men and women is an attack on the crown itself, and will be met with the full force of our justice system." By evening, Commander Jackson was in a British prison awaiting trial on multiple charges including assault, conspiracy, and international arms trafficking. His diplomatic mission had become a criminal investigation, and his moment of anger at the palace gates had destroyed not just his own life, but exposed a corruption network that reached the highest levels of his government. The visiting country's prime minister was forced to address his nation on television, acknowledging the systemic failures that had allowed criminals to infiltrate their security services. Several high-ranking officials resigned in disgrace, and a complete restructuring of their intelligence and security apparatus was announced. The retribution that had begun with a simple slap had grown into one of the most comprehensive diplomatic and criminal justice responses in recent memory. The full power of the British state had been mobilized to defend the honor of one royal guard, demonstrating that some institutions and traditions were truly inviolable. Marcus returned to his quarters that evening knowing that his service had been vindicated in the most complete way possible. The assault that had been intended to humiliate him had instead exposed his attackers as criminals and brought the full weight of justice down upon their heads. The palace grounds were quiet again, but the security protocols had been permanently strengthened. New procedures were implemented to ensure that foreign security personnel would never again be able to threaten the safety and dignity of the Royal Guard. In the weeks that followed, Jackson's trial became an international sensation, exposing the full scope of the criminal network he had led. His conviction on all charges resulted in a 25-year prison sentence, and his assets were seized to compensate victims of his various crimes. The visiting country's government spent years rebuilding their international relationships and implementing reforms to prevent similar incidents. The diplomatic consequences of Jackson's actions continued to reverberate for decades, serving as a reminder that attacking the representatives of the crown carried consequences far beyond what anyone might imagine. Captain Marcus Wellington returned to his duties with even greater respect from his colleagues and superiors. The incident had proven that the Royal Guard's traditions of honor and service were not merely ceremonial, but fundamental principles that would be defended with the full power of the state. The lesson was clear and unmistakable: those who serve the crown with honor and dignity will always be protected, and those who attack them will face swift, decisive, and devastating retribution. The slap that had echoed off the palace walls had triggered a response that would echo through the halls of power for generations to come.